Good evening and welcome to this week's edition of Behind the Headlines. It's good to be back after 3 weeks. And in tonight's programme, we'll be discussing the extraordinary and dramatic events that occurred in Russia last week with a plane crash involving the death of the leader of the notorious Wagner Group. And we'll also be asking what impact will this have on Russia, Putin, and how this fits into a Bible prophecy. Regan, it's great to be back on Behind Headlines after 3 weeks. Great to see you. And of course, this is probably the most dramatic event we've seen in kind of world affairs for most of the summer, hasn't it? The death of the notorious Wagner leader, Yevgeny Prigozhin.
Yeah, very definitely, Simon. There were a few things going on over the course of August, but this is the standout one. On the 23rd of August, Wednesday, Yevgeny Prigozhin, the head of the Wagner Group, together with its leadership, are believed to have been assassinated in a plane crash at the behest of the orders of President Putin. He's believed to have acted, of course, in revenge for that humiliating circumstance exactly 2 months preceding Prigozhin's death, wherein Prigozhin and Wagner made unhindered progress towards Moscow, looking to it seemed, stage some form of military coup.
With 25,000 troops belonging to the mercenary group known as the Wagner Group, and the fact that his forces were only 80 miles away from the capital in Moscow certainly gave Putin a huge scare. The prospect that this was the first time during his presidency that he's ever been challenged like this, and particularly from the leader of the Wagner Group. But we also see that Putin gave the Wagner mercenaries a reprieve, as well as Prigozhin himself. Were given an amnesty to flee Russia for Belarus. 2 months later, he's together with the leadership of the Wagner Group. They're all now effectively dead, and effectively this has now ended the mercenaries' ability, or the Wagner Group's ability, to actually operate militarily independent of that of the Kremlin. And we'll be asking, what does the death of Prigozhin mean for the future of President Putin and the ongoing war in the Ukraine?
It has been confirmed by the BBC that the Wagner mercenary chief, Yevgeny Prigozhin, did die in the plane crash north of Moscow. There was DNA testing of the bodies found in the wreckage, according to Russia's investigative committee. Now, I'm very confident that there will be theories out there, that there'll be individuals speculating whether or not they are fully trustworthy as a body, but just a couple of months ago when Wagner staged this coup, it would have come as no surprise to anyone that Prigozhin was assassinated. So, right now I think we can very confidently say this was something that was put off, it was delayed, but it was singularly inevitable. Russian aviation officials confirmed the aircraft and Embraer Legacy had been flying between Moscow and St. Petersburg when it crashed in the Tver region north of Moscow on Wednesday evening. Wagner-linked Telegram channel Grey Zone reported the jet had been shot down by the Russian military, although it provided no evidence to support its claim.
And also, we know that the initial reporting of when Prigozhin's plane landed just north of Moscow, this was blamed on the Ukrainians, first of all. It was obviously clearly designed to make it look like an accident, but there were too many suspicious fingerprints that look like it's got Putin's DNA all over it. So the private jet was carrying 7 passengers on board and 3 crew members, and according to preliminary information, all 10 people on board were killed. All bodies are said to have been recovered. And the Embraer Legacy, registered one of Prigozhin's companies, caught fire on hitting the ground, having reportedly been in the air for less than half an hour.
The aviation agency in Russia has identified the 7 passengers as Yevgeny Prigozhin and his right-hand man, Dmitry Utkin, Sergei Propustin, Yevgeny Makaryan, Alexander Totman, Valery Chekhalov, and Nikolai Matuseyev. The crew members were then identified as Captain Alexei Levshin, co-pilot Rustam Karamov, and flight attendant Kristina Respopova.
So we have to ask ourselves who was Yevgeny Prigozhin. And also this is an excellent taken from the Daily Telegraph. So Yevgeny, who was reported to have died in a plane crash, was age 62, was the former hot dog seller and ex-convict who went on to become a billionaire restaurateur and a global Kremlin action man, the Telegraph describes him, running the so-called Wagner Group, a shadowy army of mercenaries on behalf of Russian President Vladimir Putin. It was founded in 2014 by Prigozhin. The Wagner Group, said to have taken part in conflicts around the world. It operates and is accused of committing war crimes, including murder, torture and rape. The group came to predominance during the Donbass war in the Ukraine, where it helped pro-Russian separatist forces from 2014 to 2015 and went on to play a significant role in the Russian invasion that began in 2022, for which Putin gave Prigozhin permission to recruit inmates from Russian jails. By the end of last year, 2022, its fighting strength was reportedly grown from 5,000 to some 50,000, 4 out of 5 whom were said to be former convicts.
On June 23, 2023, Prigozhin turned on his Kremlin paymasters, launching a tirade against the defense minister Sergei Shoigu, accusing the Russian army of deliberately attacking his forces, and even suggesting that the purported threat from Ukraine, which Putin has been going on about, his public justification for the conflict, was a sham. He then proceeded to lead his men over the border in an escalating series of events which looked as though he was going to take control, or was aiming for control of Moscow, but which did see him take control of the Russian city of Rostov-on-Don, the operational center for Russia's war in Ukraine, becoming the first man to capture a Russian city from the Kremlin since Chechen rebels took Grozny in the mid-1990s. He called for a march of justice on Moscow. Yevgeny Viktorovich Prigozhin, born June the 1st, 1961, in then Leningrad, lost his father at a young age, and his mother, who later remarried, supported him along with his ailing grandmother by working at a local hospital. Spending his teenage years training to be a professional cross-country skier, his dream of that turned sour in 1979 when, aged 18, he was given a suspended sentence for theft. While on probation, he committed a series of burglaries, working with a gang, luring a woman into a dark alley, strangling her until she blacked out, then stealing her jewelry. This led to, 1981, a sentence of 13 years in jail. By the time he emerges in 1990, his time in that notoriously brutal Soviet prison system had equipped him with various skills, a certain set of skills needed to thrive in this new Russia that emerged from the former Soviet Union.
So he set up a hot dog stand on the streets of St. Petersburg, and in the cowboy capitalism of the early 1990s established a chain of convenience stores before eventually opening a series of restaurants. These included one on a floating boat called the New Island. It became a favorite of the native people from St. Petersburg. When Putin moved into the Kremlin, Prigozhin was soon doing the catering for the Kremlin banquets, earning his nickname Putin's Chef. During his first term as president, Putin entertained world leaders, including French President Jacques Chirac, President George W. Bush at New Island, where Prigozhin ministered to the guests himself, serving up dishes including Somali ostrich meat, crocodile, grey shark and piranha.
Amazing.
Exotic food.
Exotic meats there. The Somali ostrich meat sounds very nice. Prigozhin's friendship with Putin paid off in the form of contracts for his catering enterprise to supply food for schools, hospitals, and most lucratively, the Russian armed forces. And you can see just the trajectory beginning to develop with that a little bit. Over a 5-year period, according to jailed Kremlin critic Alexei Navalny Anti-Corruption Foundation, Prigozhin received government contracts worth $2.25 billion. Prigozhin would then set up his private military outfit, a motley crew of ex-soldiers, adventurers, and desperados, recruited to serve under the command of Dmitry Utkin, a former special forces officer in the GRU and admirer of the Third Reich, who had adopted the codename Wagner after the German composer Richard Wagner, allegedly because his work was greatly admired by Adolf Hitler. So for all of the talk of campaigning an anti-Nazi conflict in Ukraine, Wagner is certifiably inspired by Nazis.
Yeah, which is an irony. Yeah. Considering this is the sole justification for Putin's invasion of the Ukraine, his own mercenary private military organization that's doing a lot of Putin's dirty work finds their admiration for Hitler and the Nazis. And considering, for example, the death toll that the Nazis afflicted upon the Soviets during the Second World War, it was absolutely horrific. So this probably wouldn't go down very well amongst the Russian public, that's for sure.
Now, they began operating in the Donbass region. We can remember some of the conflict that was going on then, beginning really around 2014, but they began to shift their focus to Syria after Russia launched its intervention there in 2015. We don't talk that much about that conflict. It's ongoing, and many other conflicts across the African continent as well, which Wagner has found itself involved. Formerly, Wagner did not exist because private armies are illegal under Russia's constitution. But the value of both Wagner and the Internet Research Agency to the Kremlin was that they operated in a gray area, which gave the government plausible deniability. They could perpetrate acts of terror, they could enact war crimes even, without Russia technically being found or held guilty or culpable for those crimes. The Wagner Group went on to become involved in as many as 12 different countries, including Libya, where Ukrainian sources alleged that it was tasked with testing new Russian weapons systems. Sudan, the Central African Republic, Madagascar, and Mozambique have also featured Wagner and their perpetration of real horrors in those places as well.
Absolutely. So in 2023, some estimates put his personal fortune as much as $2 billion. His properties included a St. Petersburg estate, his own helipad, costing an estimated $105 million, a 10-acre clifftop estate with a swimming pool on the Black Sea, and a £6 million yacht and 3 private jets.
He was placed under American sanctions in connection with its leadership, with his leadership of the Wagner Group. And in 2018, a U.S. grand jury indicted him for interfering in the international politics of the United States. Friends, this is not new. Okay, the Wagner stuff is not, what we're seeing now, the war crimes, the acts which are undeniably criminal and go against everything that we know of in regards to, we can call them the rules of war, if you will. This is not new. And there's a long history of indictments even prior to this current conflict in Ukraine. This grand jury indicted him for interfering in the internal politics of the United States in 2018. Then in 2021, he's added to the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives list, with a reward of up to $250,000 for information leading to his arrest. I wonder if anyone's going to be cashing in.
And in 2021, the then British Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab imposed an asset freeze and a travel ban on Prigozhin, saying that he was responsible for significant foreign mercenary activities in Libya and multiple breaches of the UN arms embargo.
This is before the invasion of Ukraine, but before the one that people seem to care about. Of course, involved in 2014, but all of this is connected to his other military involvement elsewhere.
And it could well be as well that they are responsible for bringing down that Malaysian flight that flew over the Ukraine back in, would have been August?
That is
2014.
Yes.
So, I mean, effectively, this was a private army, mercenaries who were making huge amounts of money in terms of working in African countries, trying to stabilize and uphold dictators or to overthrow regimes so it's favorable to Russia. And this was effectively a tool of Putin in terms of the extension of his foreign policy in the Middle East and also in Africa as well. And of course, then we found out that the Wagner Group, during the war in the Ukraine, committed horrendous massacres and murders of innocent Ukrainian civilians. And even after, when this war is finished, will be wanted for war crimes. But let's just update ourselves and remind ourselves what happened with the death of Yevgeny Prigozhin.
A business jet flying from Moscow to St. Petersburg crashed, killing all 10 people aboard. Yevgeny Prigozhin, founder of the Wagner private military company, was on the passenger list. The crash occurred north of Moscow. Authorities say they're investigating. Purported videos of the crash are surfacing online. Those videos show a plane spiraling out of control with a smoke trail behind it, falling to the ground. Prigozhin led a short-lived armed mutiny against Russia's military leadership back in June. Predictions surfaced that he would be executed for the coup attempt, which was seen as a major threat to Putin's power. Prigozhin's coup attempt led to some isolation and a lack of support. His call to Putin went unanswered, and his plans failed to receive backing from Kremlin troops. Prigozhin's demands were vague, and his rebellion left him without a place in Russia. Prigozhin had once sought a deal brokered by Belarus for exile and pardon. The criminal case against Prigozhin still remains active. And despite the coup attempt, Putin's power and control over Russia remained intact. Ukrainian forces capitalized on the Russian struggle, launching counterattacks in the east. Stay tuned to CBN News for more details on this breaking story.
National security correspondent Caitlin Burke is covering the story. Caitlin, what do we know about the crash?
Jenna, we know it was Prigozhin's private plane that went down, and eyewitnesses told Russian media they heard 2 loud explosions before it fell from the sky and burst into flames on impact.
This video shows the plane suddenly plummeting from its cruising altitude of 28,000 feet. All 10 people on board are reported dead, and Russian authorities have confirmed Prigozhin was on the flight. An investigation is now underway, but so far no reason for the crash has been reported. Some images from the wreckage reportedly show puncture marks, which experts believe could suggest a missile strike rather than a bomb blast.
When we look at the wreckage, you don't see any of that outward expansion that you might see in a bomb. Also, you would think that the Wagner folks would be very protective of the airplane and not to allow a bomb onto that airplane.
President Joe Biden says he's not surprised and hinted that he believes Putin could be behind the crash.
There's not much that happens when Russia is Putin's not behind, but I don't know enough to know the answer.
Back in June, Prigozhin led a brief mutiny, pulling thousands of his Wagner Group fighters out of Ukraine and directing them instead to march on Moscow. Prior to the rebellion, the mercenary chief called out Russia's defense establishment for alleged mismanagement of the war in Ukraine and denying weapons to his soldiers. He called off the coup after allegedly cutting a deal with Putin.
Back in 2018, Putin did an interview where he said everything is forgivable except betrayal. Clearly, Prigozhin betrayed Putin, and every day that Prigozhin was walking around a free man in Russia was a symbol of humiliation and the weakness in Putin's regime.
During a press briefing this afternoon, Pentagon Press Secretary Brigadier General Pat Ryder confirmed initial U.S. assessments do suggest that Prigozhin was killed in the crash. They have no information about how the plane was taken down. However, they do not have reason to believe it was a surface-to-air missile. Jenna?
All right, national security correspondent Caitlin Burke, thank you.
And our special guest joining us for this week's Behind the Headline is none other than Colonel Richard Kemp, CBE. Richard, it's an absolute pleasure to have you on Behind the Headlines. Thank you for all that you do for Israel and the Jewish people. And thank you that you are a kind of a moral force in our world today that's sadly lacking in morals and values. But Richard, I know that you wrote an excellent piece in the Daily Telegraph regarding what happened with the alleged assassination of the leader of the notorious Wagner Group, Yevgeny Prigozhin. From your perspective, what do you think was behind this?
Well, Simon, first of all, thank you for having me on your show. It's always a great pleasure. And thank you very much for everything you do for the state of civilization in the world. I don't think there's much doubt. Obviously, it's not been proven beyond question, and it probably will never be, but I don't think there's much doubt that what happened was that after Prigozhin launched his abortive coup against Russia, including killing members of the Russian armed forces on their own soil, I don't think there's much doubt that that was the end of him. His fate was sealed from that moment onwards. And clearly there was some time elapsed while various things were put in order. And then Putin undoubtedly made the move. He would certainly have authorized an assassination effort on Prigozhin. It had all of his fingerprints all over it. In other words, it wasn't just the elimination of what Putin considered to be a traitor, but it was also a message to others who might want to follow in his footsteps. And there were various elements to it which kind of lead into that. For example, it was on exactly 2 months to the day after Prigozhin's coup began. And it was also done at the same time, pretty much the same time as General Surovikin, who was the former commander of Russian forces in Ukraine and the head of the Russian aerospace department. He was relieved of his command on that day. So there are various things that suggest that this was not just an assassination, but a very clear message. If it had just wanted to be a discreet elimination, it could have been done in many, many different ways.
Now, Colonel, if President Putin is, and we have every reason to believe he is fully behind this as an assassination, the most likely scenario seems that the Russian secret intelligence planted some form of incendiary device on the aircraft. Why do you think President Putin waited 2 months? Is it just him kind of playing a game of cat and mouse, just leading people on a little bit? How exactly do you think this has played out behind the scenes, and what can we expect going forward?
I would imagine that there was some housekeeping to be done before Putin made his move, and by that I mean, I think he would have wanted to make sure that Wagner was under control. In other words, there wouldn't be any further problem from Wagner as a result of Prigozhin's end, and so he would have made sure that those people who could have possibly led some kind of further revolt against Kremlin were either taken out of the game or paid off in the right way. So I think that's probably a significant thing. There are other things to consider as well. Wagner is such an important component of Russian foreign policy, particularly in Africa, that again, it would have been necessary to tidy things up in relation to the African heads of state that Wagner has helped to get into power, stay in power, and exploit and loot their countries. And that I think we can see that by the fact that Prigozhin was allowed to meet some of these African leaders during the St. Petersburg summit a few weeks ago. Even though he was effectively under death sentence, he may not have known that, although if Prigozhin was as shrewd as we think he probably should have done. But he was allowed to meet some of them, no doubt, again, tidying up loose ends. So I think those sort of factors fed into the 2-month delay.
And Richard, in terms of the Wagner Group, we know that they are very loyal to their leader Prigozhin. We also have the founder of the Wagner Group as well was also killed in this horrific plane crash. How does Putin expect to control the Wagner Group if he's wiped out their leadership and they're loyal to Prigozhin?
Well, I think the loyalty of the members of the Wagner Group is going to be predominantly to their paychecks, not to one individual. These are not, generally speaking, these are not the sort of people who will risk all themselves in the name of their former commander. Yes, he may have been popular among them. He may have been some affection for him, but that does not, I don't think, trump their own personal interest. And they know also that, that there's every potential they will follow the same fate if they did attempt to rise up. So I think that's rather unlikely. I would guess that we don't know what's going to happen to the Wagner Group. They may stay intact in some form. They may be broken apart. I think the likelihood is they will be subordinated to another Kremlin-controlled organization, mercenary organization, like Redoubt, for example, one of a number. But it's one of the stronger ones that's controlled by Russian intelligence, the GRU. So I think it could be that they're maybe broken up and absorbed into that in some way. But I don't think their activities, they're very unpleasant activities in African countries where they have been recklessly and indiscriminately killing people who came from the regime that they support. They've been looting vast quantities of natural minerals such as oil, diamonds, gold in particular, and that's those sort of activities they will continue to do and continue to foster instability and prop up autocratic leaders.
Is there any possibility that President Putin particularly desired Prigozhin's death, not just because of the scenario we saw play out a couple of months back, but is it likely that supporters within Wagner wanted Prigozhin to stand in the upcoming Russian presidential election?
Yeah, I mean, that is again another possibility. Prigozhin was gaining stature, particularly among the fighting forces of the Russian Federation. And, he made a big show of attacking the chief of staff and the defense minister for not supporting his own men, not giving enough ammunition to Wagner, for example, but also for betraying, and I think he used those words, betraying the fighting forces at the front line. And that would have, among soldiers who are dying in quite large numbers and who don't necessarily understand what they're doing fighting in Ukraine, that would have sit a man like that on their side, so to speak. That would have made him more popular. But I do believe, or rather I do not believe, that he was a politically significant figure inside Russia. I think he's probably more notorious in the West than he is famous in Russia. So although maybe he could have become a political force in his own right in time, I don't think that time was imminent, and probably not, in sufficient time for him to contest the next election against Putin. For what that's worth, we're not talking about a proper democracy here after all.
And Richard, considering that Russian forces have lost in the region of 300,000 soldiers in its ill-fated war in the Ukraine, which is absolutely horrific, how will the death of the Wagner leader play out in terms of military operations in the Ukraine?
I don't think it will have any effect whatsoever on military operations. Obviously, the attack on Putin, although it wasn't explained as exactly that, it was more a kind of attempt to bring down the defense minister and the chief of staff. But it was, in reality, it was an attack on Putin's legitimacy, attempting to march on Moscow, seizing the main Russian Ukraine headquarters in Rostov-on-the-Don. So I think that that had the immediate effect of weakening Putin's position and could have impacted on the war itself. had Putin not taken the bold action of getting rid of Prigozhin. And I think by doing that, Putin has again strengthened his position in Russia and with the armed forces in showing himself to be a strong leader, a czar, as he likes to think of himself.
Richard, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today on Behind the Headlines. Always a pleasure. Thank you so much for your informed military briefing that we've had there in the interview regarding the situation in Russia. And keep up the excellent work that you're doing, and thank you for it.
Thank you both.
Thank you. It's always great to hear from Colonel Richard Kemp. I'm very thankful for his very expert opinion on this ongoing situation involving the assassination of Yevgeny Prigozhin. Now, according to Daily Telegraph, British security sources believe that the shooting down of Yevgeny Prigozhin's private jet was carried out by the FSB intelligence agency on the orders of Vladimir Putin. Of course it's Putin, one source has said. Putin as a leader cannot afford to be humiliated in the way that he was. Putin functions on two things: loyalty above talent and the consequence of betrayal. All the mood music, all the habits, all the history point to the FSB. And the FSB remains loyal to Putin. British security sources believe that the shooting down of Yevgeny Prigozhin's private jet was carried out by the FSB intelligence agency on the orders of Vladimir Putin. And so we see Sir Richard Dearlove, then former head of MI6, telling the Telegraph that news of Wagner leader Prigozhin's death was unsurprising. Most people will jump to the conclusion this isn't an accident, he said. I'm sure it'll be presented as an accident and there will be an element of doubt, but everyone in the West will come to the same conclusion that this is Putin's revenge on people who challenge his power base. We used to have a saying when I worked on the Soviet Union, which was that the wise line to take on Soviet Russia was that nothing happened by accident, and one might apply that to this event.
So also see that John Foreman, who's the British Defence Attaché to Moscow from 2019 to 2022, told the Telegraph that Prigozhin's death was like a sort of Russian soap opera. He goes on to describe how the timing was not accidental. 2 months to the day that Prigozhin had marched on Moscow, his mutiny a few days later, he's dead. Mr. Putin's revenge has been served on Prigozhin. Said the speed with which the Russian system has acknowledged it strikes me as a pre-organization has been going on. Putin is willing to take revenge against those who threaten him, send a chilling effect to anyone who wants to come for him. It's in the daytime, all over the media. Everyone else is thinking that they would come for the Tsar. We'll have to think again. It shows the brutality and violence at the heart of the Russian regime, which is how he has stayed in power for so long.
According to the Telegraph as well, we see a bit of a timeline of events since that attempted coup. It was on Friday, June 23rd, that Prigozhin first threatened rebellion and his forces began their march to Moscow. He accused Russia of deliberately shelling his troops, and also, as we've already seen in CBN's helpful report, he was very angry at the lack of munitions that were available to them. There was a scarcity, and he was putting the increased amount of deaths of Wagner forces down to the responsibility or irresponsibility of the Kremlin to effectively provide the resources they needed.
Absolutely, and of course the Kremlin itself, or certainly the Russian head of the Russian military chief of staff, together with the Russian defense minister, would have felt very uneasy about the Wagner's military operation in the Ukraine because they're autonomous, or they were autonomous. Therefore, they could have no control over them. So also effectively, the Wagner Group also are the ones that carried out the horrendous human rights abuses and massacres that took place, as we've done various programs on this program on within Ukraine. And so there will be an element of wanting to control these mercenary groups, and by putting them on the front line, not giving them enough ammunition, was probably an internal way of trying to assassinate them and eliminate them as a force.
They're being treated as cannon fodder.
Because they can't be controlled.
Yeah. Exactly. And so at this point, after June 23rd, we enter onto the Saturday of June 24th. We did a program at the time reviewing this. You are welcome to go see it on demand. A Wagner Group claimed military control of facilities at Rostov-on-Don. Putin called action of these forces treason in a televised address. And as Wagner began to make progress, only finding themselves less than 100 miles away from Moscow at one point, eventually Prigozhin, somewhat suddenly and many would say strangely, given that he had to know, regardless of what happened, his end was going to occur fairly soon, ordered a halt on that march to Moscow at 8 p.m. on the reason that he didn't want further bloodshed within Moscow itself. Sunday, 26th of June, Prigozhin would be spotted back for the first time in St. Petersburg, with Russia dropping a criminal case against Prigozhin and the Wagner Group. But throughout this whole time, it was always on people's minds that his days were numbered. There would be attempts at some point to overthrow and wrest away any power over Wagner troops from him. The deal that was worked out eventually saw Wagner, essentially the troops removed to Belarus as part of the deal that he allegedly made with President Putin. And Prigozhin himself would arrive in Belarus on June the 27th, but only 2 days later would travel to Moscow to meet with Putin at the Kremlin.
Which is quite extraordinary, isn't it? I mean, you would have thought also that he would have known the repercussions of his actions, and particularly, massing 25,000 Wagner troops 80 miles from the capital of Russia, Moscow, possibly threatening a kind of regime change. He always said that this wasn't to overthrow Putin, but this was to remove the Minister of Defense and also the Chief of Staff in charge of the Russian armed forces. And so therefore it was never an attempted coup, but he must have realized the consequences going, and then the fact that Putin entered into agreement, gave him amnesty. We don't know whether their families were threatened by Putin's forces. I think that's a lot of speculation that they were actually threatened. But he would have known, I think, the calculations that he was actually making. But how could he trust Putin when he knows that Putin won't honour any agreement? And we've seen this in the case. So tell us what happens then on the 5th of July.
Well, Prigozhin's home in St. Petersburg was raided, and which is interesting because this is after terms have apparently been met and agreed upon. So after whatever peace has been allegedly made, his home is raided, with Russian media publishing photos of his lavish lifestyle. Footage also released of various passports, costumes, wigs, weapons, and boxes filled with cash and bars of gold. On the 6th of July, Lukashenko, the president of Belarus, would say Prigozhin was remaining in Russia at that time. The 27th of July, and there's a bit of a gap of intel at that point, Prigozhin is spotted on the sidelines of the Russia-Africa summit, meeting with various African dignitaries. So he was still, to some degree, on the front lines of discussions and negotiations. There's, again, another gap in regard to the intel that's available to his whereabouts, but on August the 22nd, there was a video released showing Prigozhin in an unnamed African country, saying his fighters were deployed there on a mission. And I remember, because it was just last week, Simon, looking on the BBC's headlines and seeing various quotes from him in Africa, and it was talking about that. August 23rd, next day, Prigozhin reported dead after plane crash.
So our big question is, why was he actually murdered? Well, firstly, because he attempted to bring about a coup against Putin. This humiliated Putin as well, and of course he was also very critical of Russia's performance in the war in Ukraine. But also that the Wagner supporters of Prigozhin have also challenged him personally that he should run in Russia's presidential elections that take place in March March in 2024 and claims that the Russian leader ordered his assassination to eliminate him and destroy his mercenary group. According to a US-based think tank, the Institute for the Study of War, this angered Putin, who refused to pay Belarus for hosting Wagner fighters and reduced payments to Wagner personnel. We see that satellite imagery from August the 1st to the 23rd of August shows that Wagner had dismantled almost a third of its tents at the camp in Sayal in Belarus in the previous month, suggesting that efforts to weaken the Wagner Group may have resulted in a notable flight of Wagner personnel from the contingent in Belarus.
Now, there's some impact that this is going to have, significant impact of Prigozhin's murder on Putin. Colonel Hamish de Breton-Gordon, a former British Army officer, has told The Sun that absolutely nobody is surprised. We are not surprised, I don't think, Simon, that Prigozhin has been assassinated. Apparently, he has upset the two most powerful groups in Russia, the oligarchs who keep him in power, and the most effective fighting force Putin has ever put in the field, the Wagner Group. But this is, according to Colonel Hamish de Breton-Gordon, it doesn't end with Prigozhin's death. He says that Putin has signed his death warrant here, because the oligarchs were the ones who were keeping him in power. They were very friendly with Wagner as well. And of course, the Wagner fighters have already been recorded sending a very menacing video saying that Putin and the Kremlin needed to watch itself, that in coming days they would see the repercussions and consequences of their actions. So that's going to be interesting to watch. In terms of Wagner, these people are used to being paid a lot of money to carry out the will of Prigozhin. Now there's going to be a vacuum, but Colonel de Breton-Gordon believes that these now leaderless, bloody, thirsty troops pose a real danger to Putin. The individual, let's not forget, they went from about 5,000 to allegedly 50,000 troops, and of course we're not 100% certain of where numbers are at the moment, but 4 out of 5 of these ex-convicts, many of them will have a sense of honor and loyalty to Prigozhin for helping arrange their release from prison, where many of them may very well have been consigned for many, many years. These are generally violent criminals who he was able to have join. And so what we see is they could very well, and almost certainly will go rogue at this point and see what sort of mayhem they will create. Prigozhin was a figurehead, but the real leaders within Wagner will be looking for a new cash cow. And if that means killing Russians, then I'm sure they would have no qualms about doing that at all, de Breton-Gordon believes. The colonel added that the alleged assassination exemplifies that Putin is deluded and living in his own little world.
Absolutely. And of course, there's the timings. We saw then the interview with Colonel Richard Kemp that Putin wanted to give himself time to kind of wrap up the Wagner Group and also then plan for the assassination of Prigozhin. But what also seems clear as well, though, but there's a lack of trust now, because what happens now is that within the Kremlin and those who don't support Putin and his war in the Ukraine, because they're more interested in making money and building a kind of empire for themselves and enriching themselves, will find themselves at pretty much odds with Putin. They'll see that Putin is not a man of his word. He's gone against his word. And so therefore the trust element there is actually broken, because they're saying, well, if I step out of line or if I do something that displeases Putin, then I could find myself assassinated or killed in this way. And of course, this is what Putin has done to a number of different opposition leaders, including opposition leaders, oligarchs, political personnel as well. He's actually carried out these horrendous assassinations. So there's going to be an element of huge mistrust now within the Kremlin regarding President Putin. And of course, he's got a presidential election coming up, which is always rigged, which he won last time, 80% of the vote. So it's not going to be easy for him, I don't think.
No, and one thing that we need to bear in mind is that while Prigozhin was the spokesperson, the figurehead of this group, there are battle-hardened lieutenants and others who will be carrying things forward. Many of them will have personal gripes against Russia and how keen they will be to continue being at the bidding of the Kremlin, and we'll just have to wait and see. But I think that chances are there could be an en masse turning against the Russian plan, not just in Ukraine, but elsewhere as well. Now, the question we need to ask in light of that is, what can we expect now for and from the Wagner Group? Among ordinary soldiers, there was huge sympathy for Prigozhin's coup attempt, especially among those who believed that Putin was being too soft on Ukraine. He was the soldiers' champion, speaking out against the regime's strategic failures and holding back of equipment. Various Wagner supporters, meanwhile, are already saying they will avenge their slain leader, being the only one in the Russian command in their eyes capable of battlefield success in Ukraine, such as the siege of the town of Bakhmut, where there was 9 months of horrific violence, and doubtless, war crimes were committed as well. And Putin may not even be able to purge Wagner entirely. If he did, the question is, well, where does that leave his strategy in Africa? So this is going to be extremely disruptive. And if Wagner en masse turns against Putin, well, the consequences for him will be catastrophic.
Yeah, absolutely. So in concluding the program, we have to ask some very important questions. For example, why is this an important topic that we're actually covering? We know that Russia is one of the major powers in the end times, particularly as in regards to Ezekiel 38 and 39 with the invasion of Israel. Together with a federation of Middle Eastern and African states. And we know that at this present time, there's no way that Russia could carry out such attack with a loss of 300,000 soldiers, let alone tanks and military aircraft. We also see that, Russia will play a dominant role in the end times. We see that the Russian President Putin has threatened Israel and has effectively stopped Jewish people from making Aliyah in Russia and has closed the work of the Jewish Agency. So therefore he's hindering God's prophetic work in terms of Aliyah. And we also see that as well he's also threatened Israel military operations in Syria against Hezbollah, and is arming and protecting the Iranian regime. So it's a very, very important topic, as well as the fact that Russia is actually threatening and invaded the Ukraine. He's also destabilizing the West, and national security of the West is at stake.
We cannot equivocate on this, Simon. We cannot in any way kind of cover over the impact this has had on Christians as well. It was very interesting to see, even recently, one of the Baptist leaders in Russia actually spoke out against Putin and their ongoing atrocities and spoke up in favor of Ukrainian brothers and sisters, particularly highlighting the fact that Putin has waged a war against religious freedom as well. In Ukraine, they've taken over churches, seminaries, they've bombed theological institutions as well. They have repurposed churches, evangelical churches, for their own means and devices. And so this is also something that is having very real gospel impact. But we as Christians have to recognize there's the negative impact of the persecution, yes, and we should pray for our brothers and sisters there in that. But evil always oversteps itself. So the gospel is flourishing. There are opportunities for the gospel. There are a wealth of organizations that are on the front lines helping meet the needs of various refugees, both from Russia and from Ukraine. And there are people there who are seeking to minister in a very, very meaningful and powerful way. So Putin, while he's seeking to build up his own kingdom, there's only one kingdom that's going to come. There's only one will that will be ultimately and finally done on earth as it is in heaven, and that's that of our Heavenly Father.
Amen. But we also got to remember as well that the gospel flourished during those very short years after the collapse of the Berlin Wall in 1989, together with the collapse of the Soviet Union that occurred in 1991, and then with Putin coming to power in 1999 for the first time, we see then that the door for the gospel was firmly shut, and it's been firmly shut as he strengthened and consolidate his power in Russia. His obviously his influence as a leading member of the Russian KGB during the Soviet era also prepared him for the role that he's now playing as Russia's leader. He's clearly showing his strength as Russian president with the assassination of Yevgeny Prigozhin. But with this also comes the kind of vulnerability that those in the Kremlin don't trust him. His war in Ukraine is costing the lives of over 300,000 kind of Russian soldiers, and that's going to have a detrimental impact upon the families of those soldiers and their loved ones, causing public opinion in Russia to turn against him. This creates bigger problems, I think, for Putin in the long run of how he can continue to survive. And let's also remember that the Lord allows these people into these positions, but for a period of time, and describes leaders and countries as being like grass and flowers. They're there for a short time, and then they fade.
Yeah, and that reality is a reminder not only of his power over the nations, but of the hope of those who follow him. And Isaiah 40 very much is clear. This is a world filled with bad news. It's a world that has a constant turnover of princes and powers, but he breathes and they're brought to nothing. Their flower blooms and then it dies, it goes away. And so this is what we're seeing, I believe, with Putin. The moment that I saw Prigozhin's death had occurred, of course, the immediate thought is this is Putin, but it works for Putin as well. Those who live by the sword die by the sword. And this is only going in one direction. And believers need to be resolved, first of all, in speaking up for what's good, right, and true, speaking up for what is just and honorable and that shows integrity, recognizing, yes, there's complexity in the situation. To some degree, people will look and they'll say, oh, well, there's an assumption, we've talked about it on the program, that one has to fully agree with Ukrainian politics and its leaders in order to support Ukraine against Russia. No, it has nothing to do with that. This is about the borders, the independent borders, the free sovereignty of an independent nation that has been encroached on since 2014 with all sorts of horrors told and untold. And what we're seeing is an overstepping wherein two forces of evil using one another are now tearing themselves apart.
Absolutely.
It's no surprise. It always happens.
And also, we see the evil in President Putin, yes, as well as the evil of deeds committed by Yevgeny Prigozhin as well, as head of the Wagner Group, and the untold misery that they've caused in Africa. Yes. And because it's Africa, it's not widely reported what he's been up to. Supporting rogue and authoritarian regimes in Africa, helping them come to power, giving the Wagner Group free rein to rape, murder, steal, and plunder. And of course, these crimes won't go unnoticed or won't go unpunished. And we thankfully that God is on the throne and that he is sovereign. Absolutely. And that doesn't matter how powerful man may think he is, the Lord can bring these people to nothing. Just look at the biblical example of Nebuchadnezzar.
Off-message media outlets in Russia are accused of being foreign agents, and we have this election upcoming. Ballots are so often stuffed. These tactics have been around in Russia. They've been highly effective. But as we see this conflict unfold, Russian military losses already 300,000 at least. Its economy is in crisis. Until last year's invasion, it had some measure of being able to dictate the shape of European energy markets and blackmail the world's most powerful states. But now Russia is a pariah. No one is willingly wanting to go near or touch or make deals with it. It spends billions of unstable rubles on rockets to fire at cities in Ukraine, attacking civilians without any discretion whatsoever. For the man in the street, these truths are becoming increasingly inconvenient. For the ardent nationalists, they are a humiliation. And so what we're seeing is, as everything is unfolding and reaching a critical point, I believe we can say, and I agree with the other colonel, that Putin is signing his death warrant. He's already signed it. This doesn't end well. And believers, we need to pray for the ongoing conflict and an end to it, being very aware that at this point, resolution is not going to come without a significant tragic loss of life, but resolution is highly unlikely as long as Vladimir Putin remains alive.
No, absolutely. And I think what we can conclude from this one is that, Putin may think that he's consolidated his power, certainly sent a strong message to the Wagner Group that anyone who dares challenge him in the future will face possible assassination, almost a certain assassination. But we know that that's not where the story ends, and we know that finally Russia will meet its demise during the Gog and Magog war, which is to come in Ezekiel 38 and 39.
Absolutely. Thank you, Simon, for this program. Thank you, viewers, for tuning in. We pray that this has been enlightening as we've caught up on what's been going on in Russia and Ukraine, particularly with the assassination of Yevgeny Prigozhin. Continue to pray for brothers and sisters there in Ukraine, and acknowledge that as long as Putin is there operating his authoritarian regime, he remains a threat on the surface to the gospel. But Jesus Christ will never be defeated. His kingdom is forever. Have a great evening. Bless you. We'll see you next week on Behind the Headlines.